Hello, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, and joining me to continue our series on random old games in which we literally pick out random old games and talk about them because it's the summertime is Eric Eager, SumerSports, the SumerSports show of which has become a tremendous must-listen podcast. But there is a lot of 90s football discussed, I would say, on the SumerSports show, but I don't know if it's as in-depth as we're going to go. But I asked you, Eric, I said, hey, go ahead, pick your own game, and then we'll talk about it. And I had expected to only talk about wins on the show, but maybe in classic Eager like fashion, you did pick a game in which the Vikings blew a lead. October, 31st, 1993 is where you decided to go. Explain to me the selection of this game as we are going to dive deep into some 1993 Vikings here.
Well, I think firstly, it's a game that I didn't watch live because, I'm 1993, I would have been 7 years old. I didn't really start watching football live until I was like 8 or 9. I had always been fascinated by the early 90s Vikings before I had started watching them because Dennis Green was such an interesting guy. He had like transformed that team from kind of a defense first team. This 93 team was first in the NFL. It's the last time I believe that they've ever led the league in yards per game allowed. And he transformed that team into an offense first team later with Moss and Carter and Dante and all that. And so I was always so interested in like how that team got by. And the other part was that game just got put on YouTube like a month ago. So that was like another part. The other part is where we are in the history of the NFL because 1993, believe it or not, is the last time the Detroit Lions have won a division. 1992 was the last time before this year that they were favored to win their division going into the season. So this was the last time that the Lions would go on to host a playoff game, was this year. And if you look at the 1993 standings, the Vikings were 9-7. They had beaten Detroit 13-0 in the like 2 or 3 weeks later in Silverdome. And Detroit finished 10-6. They won the final week of the season against the Packers, and they won the NFC Central. The Vikings finished 9-7. If this game is flipped, the Vikings would have won the division, and that would have been 3 straight division-winning seasons for Dennis Green coming out of the gate. So that game had a lot of stuff there. And then there was also just all the interesting stuff about Anthony Carter reemerging, how good Chris Carter had finally been. Prior to this game, Chris Carter had never had a 1,000-yard season in the NFL. This was his first one. You had Robert Smith getting that kind of his first game as the feature running back for the Vikings. The shoulder pad aesthetic was amazing. The fact he was wearing number 20 was also really funny. So there was just a lot of like interesting things about this. But to me, the number one was Detroit won the division, and that was the last time it ever happened. And they did it in large part because they were able to come back from 14 down in the fourth quarter to beat the Vikings.
Folks, I've been wearing Oakleys now for a few weeks, and let me tell you, there is a reason that Justin Jefferson and a bunch of other football players wear these things. Because they are awesome. I've got the matte black Prism Sapphire polar sunglasses on, and I've been doing all sorts of summer things with them. I've been hitting golf balls in the water, jogging, playing basketball, getting sunburned, but my eyes are in good shape. I have been missing out on this experience for a long time. They are so comfortable. I can wear them all day and never get tired of having them on. Oakley is changing the game, and it's time for you to discover a whole new world of possibilities with your eyewear. They are suited for everyday eyewear with frames and lenses, allowing you to be an extension of yourself, an expression of your personality more than meets the eye. So make a sunglasses upgrade now at Oakley.com. Oakley offers prism lens technology. What the heck is that, you ask? Well, I'm looking through it right now. It is a proprietary technology to Oakley and available for everyday settings as well. If you want to know more, and I know you do, go to Oakley.com and do your own research. And while you're at it, get yourself a pair of everyday glasses that will be sure to change your look for the better. When you wear Oakley, there really is more than meets the eye. Try it for yourself. I've worn sunglasses in the past, and I can assure you that Oakley is the best looking and best quality out there. So go on over to Oakley.com for more information today. Oakley, express your style and build a look that's made for you. Yeah, one thing that sticks out to me right away when watching this game back, and it is on YouTube if people want to go back and take a look, is what the NFL looked like in 1993. And it just seems to me that there was a shifting, and this goes for a lot of things from the early 90s to the mid 90s, changed a lot. The sound of music changed a lot from the early 90s to the mid and late 90s. And just even how football was broadcast. The broadcast is pretty rough, pretty like antiquated. The way that the Metrodome looks, it's absolutely in standard def. There's no HD going on in this game. It's on TNT, which I don't think there's a lot of people that would even remember that football was on TNT at the time. And it's just like watching something that came out of, if you, what is it called when you bury a bunch of items and then someone can dig
Yeah,
them
it's
up
like
later?
a time capsule.
Yeah, yes. This is something out of a time capsule. If you watch a game like 3 years later in 1996, it looks very close to what you see today from NFL broadcasts without much change. With this, there's like one or two camera views. It's very scratchy. It's kind of hard
All
to
the
see.
linebackers have like the biggest shoulder pads you've
Yes.
ever seen. Robert Smith has the jersey with like the non-cuffed sleeves, so he's got like Sam Bradford sleeves going. Like, yeah, I mean, it is really like a blast from the past, and like it is a very epic look into what the world used to be like, which is kind of fun. And again, like it's the last time the Lions won that division, which is kind of insane to me.
Yeah, and so this game also features a something that would happen quite often in the 1990s and even into the 80s with the Vikings franchise, that has not been the case in recent years, which is multiple quarterbacks playing in a single game. Jim McMahon and Sean Salisbury, and Sean Salisbury has a phenomenal game. And this, I don't know if this is the best game of Sean Salisbury's career, but it probably is the best game of his career. He plays excellent in this game. And you mentioned it's funny that the Vikings did have some really good defensive players, but Rodney Peete is the opposing quarterback and pretty much lights them up outside of a couple of fluky interceptions, one where he's falling down, and then another one where it's a tipped ball. There's another thing that stands out to me too anytime I watch these early 90s games, which was the hilarity of turnovers. We have gotten used to the fact that like it's very hard to get interceptions. It's pretty rare that guys fumble. I mean, you might have a game where there's two turnovers in a game and you're like, well, those turnovers really changed the game. In the early 90s, like 4 turnovers wasn't that crazy to have. There's also a butt fumble in this game that
Mhm.
it also speaks to where the NFL was, because this would have been like an all-time low light where Barry Word runs directly into the rear end of his offensive lineman and the ball pops out. And that actually kind of opens the door for Robert Smith playing, because Barry Word was a veteran. And after that fumble, I think they didn't really want to play him a whole lot anymore. And Robert Smith ends up getting a touchdown on the next drive. But I'm just, I guess, most fascinated by sort of the state of early 90s Vikings, where I don't know that finding the franchise quarterback was as talked about as it is now, where it's just absolutely everything. But I think that this type of season is maybe proof that it should have been. And the fact that the Vikings and this organization in general can never really truly pin down that quarterback spot. And it's like, oh yeah, reminder, at one point they're playing Jim McMahon at his advanced age and Sean Salisbury.
Yeah, it's so funny because there are some parallels too with, this is year two of the Dennis Green regime. You know, the it's funny, but like year one of the Dennis Green regime, they got rid of Herschel Walker, even though he could still play. He went to Philadelphia, rushed for 1,000 yards, was an instrumental part of a playoff team there, another 11-5 team. And they got rid of Herschel, who was kind of the whole this roster sucks because of this player type player. Not going to talk, about Kirk. I think Kirk has obviously had a better Vikings career than Herschel did, but a very similar sort of we're putting all of our eggs in this basket and it doesn't work. Didn't work. Year one under Green, they went 11-5. Schedule was easier. Injuries weren't that bad. Free agency didn't bite them. And then you look, and this Vikings team, year two of the regime, They traded Gary Zimmerman to the Broncos in the preseason. Gary Zimmerman's a Hall of Fame left tackle for a wide receiver named Vance Johnson, who they cut after training camp. So it's like they just gave up, Gary Zimmerman for like a first round pick and then players that didn't make the team. They had 3 new offensive linemen. Terry Allen tore his ACL in training camp. And so they're out there trading a 5th round pick for Barry Word, to go with Roger Craig and then Robert Smith. It was weird back then. If the number one 1,200-yard running back got an ACL now, they would gladly play the rookie. But back then, Robert Smith was just getting no carries because they didn't think he was ready. Anthony Carter was kind of aging out, much like Adam Thielen. They would give Jake Reed reps every once in a while, and he certainly wasn't ready. Chris Carter was emerging. Steve Jordan was, he retired after 1993. He did come back in 94 when they had injuries, but he retired after 93. So it's very similar to kind of what they're dealing with now too, which is they squeezed every last bit of juice out of the orange in 92. They try to run it back, but they can't. And they have to go in, very much down a few players. The metamorphosis in the defense came in the following year when they traded Chris Dolman and they let Anthony Parker and Audrey McMillan and Carl Lee all go. But it's very similar to where it is now, where it's like, and then the quarterback position, they were in on Joe Montana for a little bit, couldn't get him. Go with Jim McMahon. Everybody thought Jim McMahon was the piece that was going to keep them because they were so down on Rich Gannon, which is funny because he ended up becoming an MVP in the league. And what the funniest part was, McMahon was the winner that year. They were 8-3 in games where he played, but up until Salisbury got in the lineup, they never scored over 20 points in a game. And so Salisbury was weirdly going in there, kind of lighting the place up a little bit and then losing because this started a string of 4 losses in 5 games, all of them that Salisbury played, and all of them that Salisbury played pretty well. And it ultimately didn't, for reasons, I think, like when you look at him versus McMahon just managed the game better. He was not as good of a passer at this point in his career.
Yeah, it's funny about Jim McMahon and just his entire career because there's not a single season where you'd ever be impressed by his stat line. And yet he won in Chicago. He won something like 20 games in a row or whatever. And the defense was always given all the credit, Walter Payton, all the credit. And yet when you go back and watch those games, and there's one famous comeback he had against the Vikings where he came off the bench and he was injured and then he comes back against them. And the game manager knows how to win thing is kind of real in the NFL. And I wonder about when it sort of stopped being real, because it's definitely not really a thing now. I mean, I don't think that even I think it was kind of going up until recent years, where even with Teddy Bridgewater in 2015, and I think that if you were looking for a comp for Teddy Bridgewater historically, Jim McMahon is probably a good one because he didn't put up big numbers, didn't put up a lot of touchdowns, managed the game, didn't turn the ball over very often, kept the defense in it, and found a lot of ways to win. But I think that if you took the 2015 Vikings team and dropped them into 2022, that they're struggling a lot more. And, I think the idea was that Bridgewater was getting better and they were going to develop, and he never really got to play, actually never got to play with the Diggs-Thielen combination that we saw. They were on the team, but not the elite Diggs Thielen or Justin Jefferson. So maybe his numbers would have gone up. I think his arm strength was improving, but who he was in 2015, kind of a relic. Maybe we saw a little Kenny Pickett last year, finding ways to win with the defense, even though he didn't put up big numbers. But at this time, you could do that. And Jim McMahon did a lot of that, but I forget now because I just watched the game a couple days ago in the first half. Did he get injured in this game or taken out of this game? He was injured.
He got hurt like in drive number 2, bad shoulder. He made a nice throw to Anthony Carter early. But yeah, it was pretty much, and it was one of those, the funny thing about McMahon, I don't think it's funny, but like he got hurt so much that he just like knew, like he was just like, yeah, my shoulder's out. This is 4 weeks type of thing. Like, and yeah, I mean, it's funny that you talk about like the game managing thing. Cause McMahon threw like pick sixes in this season. He threw one against the Raiders. He threw one against the 49ers. And those are mostly when they were out of the game. When the Vikings were like in games, he did so many things that were like trust your defense type plays where he would dump, he would dump it off or he'd take a sack or something where he just like would not put his defense in a bad position. And to your point, like that kind of quarterback could win back when defenses could win. Now defenses can't win, by and large. And so it's just like not plus EV to not push the ball downfield and stuff like that. But like when you watch Salisbury, he would like throw interceptions in bad times. He'd take sacks in bad times. There were like these little field position things where he would struggle and it would cause more variance in the game. And like, you go on after this game for the Vikings, they go and I believe they played San Diego the following week, lost. Salisbury throws a big pick in that game, even though he's very productive. They go to Denver. They have a 17-point deficit. He comes back and wins. I think he throws for like 400 yards in that game. It was very impressive. But even to get them down, he threw interceptions and fumbled and stuff. And then, after that, he just struggled to win football games, even though he was Anthony Carter had 300-yard games when Salisbury was starting. So it was like very productive, but just in a weird way. And maybe a lot of it's noise. But some of it was just like Denny very much thought he could win with McMahon. And he did. I mean, the only loss after McMahon came back was to Dallas, who was a Super Bowl winner. They lost that game at the Metrodome. They played games where they were kind of like close and tight, and McMahon delivered. And he delivered against Green Bay, which is a playoff team, against Kansas City, which won the AFC West. Like he was very much, and Detroit, they won a 13-0 game now. The only touchdown in that game was a pick six. So it's like not really McMahon doing anything, but at least not screwing it up. Like it was very much a weird season where this was not a good football team. They somehow eked their way into the playoffs because they had the number one defense. And, Jim McMahon averaging 5.9 yards per pass attempt somehow was 8-3 or something when he played.
Yeah, and maybe I'm giving a little too much credit to these days versus back in the day, because the Super Bowl was, I believe, this year Dallas and Buffalo, two of the best offenses of all time, with Troy Aikman and Jim Kelly, and that was usually the case in the NFL, even going back to the 90s. But maybe there was just a little more opportunity to have a game manager play defense, particularly because teams love to kick field goals. Short field goals. They love to run the ball. They love to play conservative and that kind of thing. But this game, really, there's a few things that stand out from it to me. One of them is this is a rare game where Barry Sanders does not annihilate the Minnesota Vikings, which I think maybe speaks to their defensive talent, even though they allow 30 points and they allow the lead to be squandered away in this game. But, when you're watching these two running backs, and I think of the peak running back era in the NFL as being early 2000s, late 90s. So coming off Terrell Davis, a lot of offenses wanting to kind of follow along with that. And then those classic, Larry Johnsons pop up for a couple of years. Your Priest Holmes, this guy is sort of the flavor of the, Chris Johnson a little bit later than that. But I think that the early 90s, with Barry Sanders being so dominant, Emmitt Smith, Thurman Thomas, you kind of had this big three of superstar running backs. And Robert Smith comes along a little bit later when he's healthy and gets a chance to really play. But this game was sort of, in a way, demonstrating the importance still of running backs back then. And this is a discussion that we're having all the time now. I see everybody's writing about it, of running backs, and writing columns of like, should running backs be paid more and why aren't they paid and all these things. And you were talking about like developing Robert Smith, and we're just seeing the very early development. There is no development for running backs. You draft them and it's like, you're in, buddy. It's actually weird that Alexander Madison has had 4 years as a backup to kind of, quote, develop, that normally you're like, well, yeah, I mean, we draft you. Dalvin Cook is in week 1. You're playing, and that is normally the case, but not so much then. So I thought that the running back element of this game and just that era really stuck out to me how different it was.
Yeah, for sure. Like this idea that it's so weird, right? Like it's this idea that you would have Terry Allen. Now, this is the second time that the Vikings had a 1,200-yard back, and they drafted a rookie running back in the first round. I mean, Chester Taylor into Adrian Peterson, Terry Allen into Robert Smith. The funny thing about Robert Smith, and he actually said this on a USFL broadcast of the day, he knew the gravity of the situation, because from 89 to 1992, there were no number one picks because of the Micah Merriweather trade and then the Herschel Walker trade. So he knew that like he was the first one in a long time. And they go with running back, even though they had a guy on the roster who was in theory like a very good one in Allen, and Allen went to go play for Washington and was fantastic after that. And they had Roger Craig in the stable. And then they still go and trade a fifth for Barry Word. It's such a weird time. I don't think we'd ever think of these things now at all, which is cool. And one of the reasons why these games, these podcasts about these games is so fun, because it gives you a look into the soul of the NFL at a time when it was way different.
Yeah, and I like that. I just try to connect a lot of different things to what's going on now. And one of those things also, there's always these great like remember that guy. And one of the things there's like two versions of that. There's remember that guy because he's hilariously random and you totally forgot he existed. But then there's like remember how good that guy was. And in this game, Rodney Peete to Herman Moore for a 93-yard touchdown. Remember how great Herman Moore was. And Herman Moore only had a short run of real greatness, just a couple of seasons, and their offense was really elite. And this is where their offense had not yet really transitioned into that three wide receivers where it was Johnny Morton, Brett Perriman, and Herman Moore. And then opposing defenses would still be running three linebackers out there just getting crushed by Scott Mitchell of all people. But they were kind of running like a run and shoot open type of offense at that point. Although there is one point in this broadcast where they declare the run and shoot is dead. They're like, there's no more run and shoot. They're playing big tight ends now these days. And, again, these transitions where we see offenses and trends changing all the time. But is it crazy to say that peak Herman Moore kind of reminds me of Justin Jefferson? Now, he was taller at
and slower,
6'4" and not as fast. But the ability to track the football and make plays on the ball, no matter what the circumstance. They threw out a bunch of inaccurate quarterbacks during his time, and that is not something Jefferson has. Jefferson has a very accurate quarterback, but over the years, he had 4 straight 1,000-yard seasons once he kind of hit the scene and was just one of the premier players in the entire NFL. And you could just throw him the ball at any time, anywhere, and he would find a way to catch it.
Well, the Wayne Fonts Lions. I mean, there's so many things to talk about with Herman Moore here, right? Because the one which was funny was the fall from grace for Todd Scott, where Todd Scott in 92 made the Pro Bowl at 5 interceptions. I think 3 of them were against Cincy. One of them, he had the pick six that basically ended Mike Ditka's career in Chicago. And 93, he already had become this kind of like box safety, poor man's Landon Collins. And on Herman Moore's 93-yard touchdown, him and Carl Lee, a perennial Pro Bowler, like got cover 2 and cover 3 mixed up. If you look at the all 22 that they showed, and Herman Moore is just streaking down the sideline. And yeah, I mean, Herman did it. This 93 Lions team, they had already gone Rodney Peete and then Andre Ware, which by the way, Andre Ware got cut after 93, joins the Vikings, got beat out by Sean Salisbury again. For the third stringer job behind Moon and Brad Johnson. And you had Herman Moore in 95. Chris Carter had just come off a year where he had 122 catches. Herman Moore had the Saturday game against the Bucks, and they started the season 3-6. They won 7 straight games. They made the playoffs in 95, kept Wayne Fonts' job again, the Cardiac Cats. That was Wayne Fonts' style, was to start like 2-8 every year and then make the playoffs. But they were up so much that Scott Mitchell was just standing up and throwing hitches to Herman Moore to get him to 123 catches. And the following day, Chris Carter and the Vikings played the Bengals. They needed, and I remember this like it was yesterday, they needed to beat the Bengals in Riverfront. They needed the Bears to lose to Philly, who was already clinched, so that was a tough one. And they needed Atlanta to lose to San Francisco. And they went 0-3. They blew a 21-point lead to the Bengals on the road that day. Classic Vikings. The Falcons with Bobby Hebert, one of my friends, as you mentioned, come back and beat the Niners. The Niners needed that game for the 1 seed. And Chris Carter doesn't get his 123 catches. So Herman Moore actually for a while had the record for most catches in a season. It was broken by Marvin Harrison. But he, very good receiver. And the funny part was in 95, he and Brett Perriman both, I think, set the record for duos in receptions, yards, and touchdowns in a season by wideouts. So the Lions were kind of on that like leading edge of like, wow, how the heck did these offenses get good in the 90s? And then, because of Scott Mitchell, they weren't able to stay good, but they had a moment there. Scott Mitchell's 95 year was one of the better years of that decade.
So I do want to talk about just the transitioning from an older team to what the Vikings would become a little bit later in the mid 90s and then setting up for eventually Randy Moss, because I think that is relevant to where they are right now. But I wanted to ask, like, just what else about this actual football game stood out to you? Just to take it through, the Vikings get up 27-13. Salisbury's playing great. Robert Smith's running all over the place. And then the 93-yard touchdown happens in the fourth quarter to cut it within 7. Jason Hanson, one of the best kickers. I mean, Fuad Reveiz versus Jason Hanson, quite the battle.
All-time kicker match.
Yes, all-time kicker. And then they give up a touchdown at the very end of the game for the Lions to win 30-27. But what other parts of the actual football game, beyond the things that we could tie to today, did you like?
Well, it's so funny because the Vikings thoroughly got screwed in this game. Like, Barry Word did not fumble in the flat, right? Like, he caught the ball, like things like laying, and they have no replay. So
Willie Clay, no replay, yeah.
Yeah, Willie Clay picks the ball up, runs it in. So in theory, it should have been 27-7 or 27-6 or whatever it was. That didn't count. The broadcast, which, by the way, you had the contrast of like the TNT got Sunday Night Football until like halfway through the year, and then they got basketball, and then they had ESPN. Pat Hayden, whoever the heck was with him in that booth, compared to Mike Patrick, Paul McGuire, Joe Theismann, no comparison. And I love the Fruit of the Loom halftime show, don't get me wrong. But the ESPN Sunday Night Football, Thursday Night Football package was so much better than TNT's, which is probably why they ended up getting Monday Night Football in the end. But then, so Robert Smith scores. They're all like making a fit over the fact that Robert Smith doesn't score, even though I think it was like first or second down. So it would have probably been a touchdown anyway. And then Anthony Parker, the poor nickelback for the Vikings, gets called on fourth down for pass interference. It just simply is not pass interference. And so the Vikings win the game, win the division ultimately. If that's not called, then it's called. So it's funny because I wanted to watch this game because it was the last time Detroit won the division. But they won the division on some Mickey Mouse nonsense that happened in this game in a couple of different ways. And so you even think about how luck is just such a weird thing. The Lions probably have lost the division in like completely unlucky ways since from 94 on. And their last division title was gift wrap for them. So maybe like be careful what you wish for. But, if you get one now, you might never get one for another 30 years, which has been the case with the
Lions. Yeah, it is. I was thinking about this for like the Lions and the Jets have had these similar trajectories of just things going wrong all the time and keeping them out of ever being really a contender, except for those couple of years with Mark Sanchez, and how there's so many teams, because this is what you hear about, like moving on from Kirk and things like that, is people will be nervous. Like, well, what if we move on from him and we pick the wrong guy? And what if we become the Jets? And with 32 teams, you can use all of their histories, or 31 other teams, to make any point you want to make. Any point you want to make about any team, because you could go to the Buffalo Bills, who missed the playoffs for like 20 straight years, and then go, well, they found their franchise quarterback. But usually a lot of things have to kind of go right for you. But I was thinking about that with the Lions here and how much talent they had in the 90s, and sort of through the years, if you built a Lions all-star team and put it up against other teams, you would probably build a very good team with the number of players that they've had, and just, have just been so bad. But you go back to then, and they had been a fairly consistently competitive team. You mentioned instant replay. I thought about that a lot during this game, because I have just despised in all sports the increased instant replay. It is one of the things that drives me completely insane. I go to WNBA games and I sit there and they're reviewing whether somebody smacks somebody else in the mouth on purpose or by accident. And like, well, should it be a flagrant? Should it not be a flagrant? And, the DJ's doing his best to just play the heck out of every song he's got. But you're sitting there for like 8 minutes figuring out if somebody hit somebody in the face. Like, I don't need this. And the NFL, though, I have to admit it needed it pretty badly. Like this, and I mean, pass interference still remains a problem, but every year we have columns written, we have outrage over refereeing. Oh, the refereeing is so bad and we're still getting these things wrong and everything else, which is true, but it is nowhere near as bad as it used to be. I mean, the refs in this game and in many games that you used to watch, they were way overmatched, probably undertrained, and just were kind of guessing. I think that they've become much better at their jobs, but I have to admit that instant replay needs to be a part of the NFL because it is impossible to tell, like if Robert Smith broke the plane or if Barry Word actually fumbled. I thought at the end of the game, I don't know, you could say they got screwed. I thought they got kind of some breaks one way or the other, but yeah, the fumble is a huge play in this game, giving up for a touchdown.
The one thing that was always interesting about the Vikings back then when they had John Tierlink as the defensive line coach and like Tony Dungy, they were tolerant of a great deal of offsides penalties by their defensive line. Like Chris Dolman, I don't know if Chris Dolman's PFF grade would have been that great because he would have got all these minus 0.5s for jumping off sides all the time. But they jumped off sides a lot, and I don't know, like they beat the heck out of Rodney Pete. So like maybe it was worth it, to an extent. But yeah, it was the Wild West out there. And maybe that contributed to some calls that like made little sense to me at the time because yeah, it was a crazy game from that perspective. Like the officiating was not A1, that's for sure.
And you also mentioned, and before we get to the kind of connection to where the teams are today, but this was kind of Chris Carter's breakout season. Not his breakout game necessarily, but his breakout season as a Viking, where he goes from being kind of a good receiver who was known for catching too many touchdowns in Philadelphia to like pure greatness. And then it explodes from there with Warren Moon throwing the ball 57 times in every game. But what I am always so impressed by with Chris Carter, number one is, for the time, his target to reception ratio is always ridiculous for the time, where quarterbacks are completing 50% of passes, 55% of passes regularly, and he is catching 60-70% of the passes his way pretty routinely. And in this game, it's like 9 for 11 targets. He's just open all the time. Like because Randy Moss was so great, it does overshadow. There's no way around it, the excellence of Chris Carter. And I feel like in this game, you could really see or start to see where this was headed with Chris Carter being the centerpiece and not Anthony Carter anymore taking over. And it's not that he has big plays. He has 8 catches for like 88 yards or something like that and a 20-yard touchdown. But there's they're starting to look his way. He's getting open. He's making catches all over the place. And I feel like this was a turning point for him, of him emerging as a superstar wide receiver. And I guess, you can sort of tie that into where they were in the team build, because when you look at 94, 95, 96, they start to really transition that roster. And I don't know if there's lessons from 93 to where they went eventually in 1998 to build, one of the best teams of all time just a couple of years later. But it is something that is not new in the NFL when we talk about these timelines. I think that our vision has been really sharpened by the amount of coverage to these things, the amount of sort of inside the front office that we're always doing, former GMs who are talking all the time, and at least the ones that make sense. And, I just think that like this sort of shows you that timelines were still a very important thing to these teams, even going back to the 90s. And maybe even if there wasn't as much thoughtful, like intentional focus on it as there is now with Kwesi Adofo-Mensah.
Right. I think, I mean, one thing that I really enjoyed about Dennis Green was he saw the forest for the trees in a very, like, he was not a great play caller. He didn't call the plays. I mean, it's funny because they go on this discussion on the show about how bad the Vikings offense was, and they really only had one drive, a touchdown drive that was more than 60 yards. I think that the display was they had not scored more than 19 in a game all year, and the game, and they had like 4 defensive touchdowns to get them to those numbers. The previous week against the Bears, they scored 19. 7 of it was on an Audrey McMillan touchdown on an interception. But beyond that, it was just like not, they had defensive scores in games, and that was how they got some of their points. And Denny had to fire Jack Burns after week 2, go with Brian Billick, and Brian Billick was the kind of seeing his way there. Carter had emerged, and it was like a string of Chris Carter being the team's leading receiver with Wade Wilson, Rich Gannon, Sean Salisbury, Jim McMahon, Brad Johnson, Warren Moon, like all that. It was Jeff George. Denny had this very interesting worldview that the quarterback was just one of 11 players, but he also had, like, I think, a very understated worldview, which was offense is what wins. So they start out 92, 93, 90, 94. They gave up like less than 1,000 yards rushing in 94 or something like that. It was 2006, 2007-esque in 94. But because they had lost Audrey McMillan, Carl Lee, Vincey Glenn, and they were starting guys like Corey Fuller, Dwayne Washington, Orlando Thomas, they were decimated via the pass. They kept getting decimated because they traded Chris Dolman to the Falcons the next year. They let Henry Thomas go, interestingly, to the Lions. That defense, by the time it got to 98, the only guy left was John Randall. That was the only player that they built the thing around. And they just kept putting resources in the offense. Everett Lindsey started this game at left tackle. He was the first Viking in club history to start opening day as a rookie offensive lineman in 93. This team was 30 years into their existence and never had that happen. By the time you get to 98, it's Todd Stussy, Randall McDaniel, Jeff Christie, David Dixon, Corey Stringer, first round picks, guys they've invested in. And like, I think this was like kind of the whole, like, well, we can't win with defense and we're going to need, something. And they sort of pulled, they got Warren Moon around the next year. Warren was older. But they built around him. It's like 9 new starters on offense the following year, because I think like they look at this and like, well, we're a defense that is not giving up anything and we can't beat Detroit at home. So let's start reevaluating ourselves.
But I think the similarity, if we're tying them together, is you could see on offense the pieces that they had, including Jake Reed that you mentioned, Quadri Ismail as well, who turned out to be a very good wide receiver for them. Not always the surest hands, but certainly the best speed. But a significant player in their offense for the Warren Moon years. And they essentially had, and Robert Smith being a young player as well, they had this setup that they could drop Warren Moon into. And this is something that we've discussed about. We're always talking about, all right, well, the next year after Kirk, they're going to draft a quarterback, and like, that's the answer. And there's also this other universe of going the Warren Moon route, or the Kirk Cousins route, actually, once upon a time, of somebody else coming available and then them being dropped in. But it did pop into my mind. I know it's not about this random old game, but this is what's great about random old games, is that they start discussions about eras and everything else. How do we view Warren Moon as a Viking versus Kirk Cousins as a Viking?
A very good question. I mean, Warren had a Hall of Fame career prior to joining the Vikings. He had some success after. We don't know what kind of success Kirk's going to have after. Warren was older when he got to the Vikings, and Kirk is now 37, I think, when he started with the Vikings, and ultimately got to like 39 or 40 when he left. The second half of 95, Moon was better than anything Kirk's ever done. But the inconsistency that Moon had in 94, early part of 95, and then 96, he was dreadful before he lost his job to Brad Johnson, got hurt. So, I mean, Moon was productive. He showed the Vikings, I think, what was capable if you had a great quarterback, which, but they sputtered a lot in the red zone. A lot of drop passes. Kadri was one of them. A lot of drop passes and a running game that they just simply never trusted. I know Terry Allen had 1,000 yards in 94, but it was kind of like a very weak sauce version of that. Robert Smith never stayed healthy when Moon was on the team for very long. So I think Moon is probably top 8 Vikings quarterback of all time, but I don't think you can put his Vikings career in the conversation with Cousins. I mean, even Keenum's highs were much better than Moon's highs, which is kind of interesting. Moon, one of the best quarterbacks to ever play. But once he got to the Vikings, I think you have to view it as a disappointment. He started one playoff game. They lost to the Bears at home, Steve Walsh. It was certainly, they got as many home playoff games as Kirk has. So it's kind of weird, but I think Kirk played better than Moon has, kind of on balance.
Yeah, so the thing about Moon is that they really asked him to be the entire team, and that's what for Cousins has sort of fluctuated from year to year with his time here. Where Warren Moon, like he was setting all of these records passing. If you go through and watch any of those 94 games, that's always the discussions. Like Warren Moon's putting up these insane numbers, and those numbers now would look pretty normal if you're throwing for the amount of yards that Warren Moon was. Back then, it was not normal to have a guy who was throwing 40 to 50 times in pretty regular fashion, because that was their offense, and the defense, as you mentioned, had been turned over. And so it kind of had to be that way. I think it is one of the interesting elements of Kirk Cousins' career that he shows up and they want him to be the centerpiece of the offense in 2018. And then they're like, no, actually don't be the centerpiece of the offense in 19 and 20. And then in 21, he kind of has to be, because the running game wasn't as good as it had been the year before. But they're still kind of centering it around Delvin. Mike Zimmer is still very upset every time they're not running. And then last year, Kevin O'Connell comes in and says, no, you have to be our quarterback and throw all the time and everything else. And the results overall were 13 wins. So you can't take away from that. The results offensively, I thought, were pretty mixed. When you have a team that did have high point totals, some of that point total is coming back from 30-something points against Indianapolis, which is totally unnecessary. And their scoring percentages weren't that good. Lots of inconsistency. I think last year actually kind of reminded me of a Warren Moon season where they were throwing and throwing and throwing, and it was all about the wide receivers, and it was all about the passing game. And some weeks and some quarters, and this is what I always take away from watching Moon, some quarters, you're like, how did this team not win the Super Bowl with Warren Moon? They were so good. And then other quarters, they just couldn't get anything going. And it's almost a little bit like shooting 3-pointers in basketball. When you're hot, you're unstoppable. And when you're not, if you don't have Steph Curry at the quarterback position making the 3-pointers consistently, if you have kind of it's Moon and Kirk are both like this during their careers, where they have and Moon, of course, is a Hall of Famer, so it's a different level, but they have this, when they're great, they're great. And when they're down, they're down. And with Kirk, you could tell that really from the very outset of games. But I don't know. I guess it's an interesting comparison to me because there's multiple seasons where there's so many Vikings quarterbacks that don't even have multiple seasons, like Jim McMahon, who's playing in this game, and Sean Salisbury never had multiple seasons as an actual starter.
Yeah, for sure. And Rich Gannon only had kind of that 1 year, 92, where he started opening day. Brad Johnson kind of had 97, but even then he, faded, he got hurt with the neck. And then, Randall had the 1 full year. But yeah, I mean, we don't have that many seasons contiguous of Viking quarterbacks. Wade Wilson kind of, but he was always sharing the job with Tommy Kramer at the end. Kramer had his years, which is why, I think if you talk about Vikings quarterbacks, it starts the conversation with Tarkington. Then you're picking among Dante, who I think had a much better career than Cousins. Then Cousins is probably third, and then Tommy Kramer, because he had those moments. And Joe Cap, you had some guys who started, but the conversation doesn't go very far because not that many guys have played for that team for all that long. And there was a lot, and they had a lot of success. And this is, we think about Dennis Green, made the playoffs basically every year as the Vikings head coach, different quarterback almost every year too. And it's so funny that they were able to generate that success in moving from a defense first team to an offense first team. They never, until Dante and, got the quarterback being in that long-term position. And even then, that was only 2 years of Dennis Green's era. It was 2000, 2001. Because the wheels fell off of the defense so quickly that Denny had to get fired after 2001. It's a strange franchise, and I think that this is an example of the strange. They're contending for a division title with Jim McMahon at quarterback and Sean Salisbury relieving him. That's a really funny, and that's what it's requiring for Detroit to be back to being favorites again in this division, which is transients, quarterbacks in Green Bay, Chicago, Minnesota.
Yeah, that it really does show you when you watch a game and it looks like this on the broadcast. Yeah, that's the last Lions team that is on this broadcast that you can barely see, really. And the Metrodome, it's just, they're running by. There's the cutouts for the
The game is probably
bases.
blacked out.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, it probably was those old blackout games. So anyway, I just, this is why we do this, because there's a lot of fun discussions that stem off of these old games. So was there anything else that you had wanted to point out from Vikings and Lions 1993?
No, I mean, it's just so much fun going back and watching and looking at the context of how things were put together back then and how they're put together now. And the differences are drastic, and it's fun to go back and look at them.
Yeah, no, it certainly is. So we'll continue our series throughout these weeks until we get to training camp. And then, of course, we'll get back into all the hardcore training camp battles. And, we'll continue to do that as well. If people have fans only questions, feel free to go to purpleinsider.com and send those. And of course, if you are not listening to the Sumer Sports Show, well, we're sitting here messing around. And yesterday I was making fun of Pro Football Talk headlines and things like that, screwing around, talking about old games. You guys are going into like really fascinating front office kind of high level discussions. And I'm learning a lot from every show. So Sumer Sports Show, make sure you go check it out. And we will be back together talking maybe a little WNBA somewhere and all sorts of Vikings talk in the near future.
Yeah, the WNBA blessed us with Mercury Aces while we're recording this. The best team in the league versus a team that's tanking. So God bless them.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of that this year. So anyway, well, thanks, Eric, for your time. And thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And we'll do it again soon.